Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalren, and in today's video I kind of just want to talk a bit about dungeons, but also I want to talk a little bit about the World of Warcraft class fantasy and BFA. So far I'd say I'm enjoying BFA a lot, and one of the things that I've been doing the most probably is dungeons. Whether it is heroic dungeons, mythic dungeons, any kind of dungeon, just to get as much gear as humanly possible. One thing I noticed is the experience and what some of these dungeons require from certain classes. Blizzard have stated in the past that they're changing the way they're going to be approaching a lot of the classes and class design in Battle for Azeroth, with the main motto, bring the class, not the player. Now, normally Blizzard says that you shouldn't worry about what class your friend might be playing, just bring the better player. If they know how to play their class, they'll probably be best for the content. If you got a bunch of buddies and all of them are rogues, you should be fine as long as they're really good at what they do. But then they decided to bring back a little bit of the class fantasy and the class importance. Of course, when you go into a dungeon or a raid, it is very shallow when just about every single class is very similar to one another, bar a few unique things, like rogues having stealth, hunters having pets, and warriors having fear. I mean, there's not really a lot that separated you but damage. What a lot of classes wanted to do is be as close on the damage chart as possible, and that was the only thing that separated one class from the other. Now, I feel like a lot of people will agree with me that that's kind of where a lot of the flavor for World of Warcraft has been lost for a lot of people. In the past, there was something every single class brought to the table. Whether some classes might have been just very high upfront damage, other classes might have not been the best in damage, but at least they brought maybe an ability, a utility, maybe even a unique buff that the raid might think, hey, we might want you on our team. Hey, we might need that if we run this specific comp. Hey, you can actually affect us and be useful in your own unique way. By having classes bring something unique to the table, there was an opportunity for certain classes and even specs to not deal nearly as much damage as others, but at least they still bring something unique to the table, unique to the team. So in this collaborative effort, without that class, certain parts of the content would be difficult, if not to some extent impossible. This aspect of uniqueness, something that you were really good at, even though it might have not been the highest damage in the world, being good at a certain class created a little bit to that class identity and class uniqueness. A uniqueness that I think a lot of us can agree that the game have kind of lost for a lot of the classes over time. There's a lot of expansions you can use as an example to pinpoint where it started to go wrong for World of Warcraft in terms of class uniqueness and class design and class identity. But I will use Legion as an example, as that is the freshest expansion in my mind. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed Legion tremendously, but we can all agree that a lot of the classes that ended up being the best ended up kind of being jack of all trades. For example, at the beginning of Legion, you would have, let's say, monks and you would have rogues. And for PvP in particular, rogues and monks were very similar. Rogues and monks both had a very high damage burst playstyle of hit and run. You would open up on the target, do as much damage as possible, force cooldowns, retreat, wait it out, wait for your cooldowns to be back, come back at the enemy and do this as many times as it was necessary until the enemy was dead. The difference was rogues fairly early at the game got pretty heavily nerfed to the point where a lot of people even considered, hey, normally in our composition we would run with a rogue, but because monks are very similar to rogues in terms of their crowd control, in terms of their playstyle, and in terms of the setup, it was like a rogue minus the stealth, but still better. They were just overall better, and so they were very similar to rogues and what rogues would bring to the table. As another point of contention, I will use PvE content, mostly in Mythic Pluses. For example, you have a lot of classes that have an AoE stun. You have Shadow Priest, you have Windwalker Monks, and you have Demon Hunters. But why would certain groups take a Demon Hunter over a Shadow Priest? Well, while both of those classes have an AoE stun, Demon Hunters output far more damage, a lot faster, while Shadow Priest takes a while to set up. Demon Hunters have a hell of a lot more survivability than a Shadow Priest. Demon Hunters have an interrupt at a 14-15 second cooldown compared to the Priest, longer setup. Demon Hunters bring self-heal capability and mass AoE damage, while Priests have to spec for either single target or either AoE. So you had a class that was more of a jack of all trades. Even though a Shadow Priest and a Demon Hunter were unique, the AoE stun, the Demon Hunter simply just had more positives than the Shadow Priest, which is why a lot of people brought the Demon Hunter over the Shadow Priest. Because the game went down for DPS, for example, in the checklist of do you have an AoE stun? Yes, you considered. Do you have high on-demand AoE burst? Yes, you considered, another check mark. Do you have high amounts of survivability? Yes, another check mark, you're still considered. So a lot of those classes that had something unique but weren't really jack of all trades that everybody else wanted, a lot of those classes end up falling short. When you scale the game all about trying to be at the top of damage charts, trying to equalize everyone's damage as best as possible, you end up making no class unique, something that has been definitely lost over the previous expansions. But I feel like there's a high amount of potential in BFA that this is about to change. As I said at the beginning of video, I've been doing a lot of dungeons and I've been playing with a variety of different classes. Some classes are performing high amounts of damage, while others not that much, but those classes that are not performing insane amounts of damage bring crucial aspects of gameplay, something their spec or even just their class can do that actually changes the content. Even the way that Blizzard has structured some of their dungeon content to suit certain uniqueness about certain classes, the way that they structure their dungeons, I really do have to give them credit. So let's start with a few examples. What the hell am I even talking about? I can talk about class uniqueness, I can talk about class identity, structuring, certain abilities, you know, a lot of these buzzwords. But let's talk a bit about some of the more concrete examples. When is the last time you had to use lockpicking on your rogue? Maybe last time a buddy of yours or some random passerby asked you to unlock a lockbox, but I don't really remember me really using my lockpicking skill all that much. This is something that rogues used to use quite a lot way back in the day, way back in the heyday, and I have a couple of buddies in the guild that would tell me some of the things like how unique it was and how integral it was to the gameplay. Blizzard found a way to make lockpicking and the rogue identity a lot more shinier in BFA. There's a dungeon in BFA called Tol Dagor, and to give you a quick synopsis of this, it is a Kulturan Guantanamo Bay style of dungeon that hosts a bunch of criminals inside of it, and Horde and Alliance both have to break into those dungeons to find out what the hell is going on. If you end up doing that dungeon and you have a rogue in your group, you'll find out that because you brought a rogue to that dungeon, now you have extra access to rogue utility of lockpicking. As you go through the dungeon, you find a lot of prisoners. Some might even be prisoners of your faction, and if you release them, they give you an extra buff. An extra buff of intellect, stamina, maybe even damage, as well as a paladin wisdom buff for everybody. This means that the dungeon becomes a lot easier as your team has an extra buff over whatever buffs you've already brought, just because you have a rogue. Also, the rogue can open you shortcuts rather than making the whole dungeon experience linear. Now you can find ways to avoid certain trash bag of mobs, mostly because you brought the rogue. As you near the second boss, the werewolf boss, you can actually use the rogue to cheese the mechanic a little bit. Normally the fight goes on where you would open up the fight with the boss and eventually he would hit the party with a smoke bomb, then run around from jail cell to jail cell releasing mobs that would help him in the fight. So not only would you have to fight the boss, now you have to fight all these extra adds on top of the boss at the same time. This can slow down your progress and might even cause your party to wipe if you're unable to deal with the boss damage as well as the damage of the adds all at the same time. But if you have a rogue, you can kind of cheese it by releasing those inmates early and taking care of them one by one, so then during the fight with the werewolf guy, as soon as he starts opening the cells, no extra NPCs will come out, making the fight a ton easier. This type of uniqueness is one of the biggest for rogues for this dungeon in particular. Rogues generally is a class that doesn't really get to do much but, you know, throw blind, stuns, and usually put out a buttload of damage with abilities like Cloak of Shadows and Feint for them to survive a lot of the mechanics, but they don't really do anything unique up until that one dungeon. This is where the class uniqueness literally shines through the content. Now the rogue example is pretty big and it really applies for one dungeon, but let me give you a few more ideas where, let's say, a rogue, a class that is heavy on crowd control, may play a part in certain other dungeon mechanics. There's a few mechanics in dungeons like Shrine of the Storm and Temple of Sathralis where one of your party members gets imprisoned, and normally you have to DPS this prison down to release them before the party member dies. Blizzard is able to avoid this boring DPS check mechanic by allowing players that have a lot of crowd control, like stuns, maybe even incapacitates, maybe even disorienting effects, blinds and such. You allow those classes to use crowd control to release their allies faster. So instead of just dumping damage into the prison that the ally is in, slowly dying, you can actually have a rogue run up and gouge them out of it. You can have a warrior fear, let's say, the tentacles that are holding the ally down in Shrine of the Storm. You can have someone stun the prison off. Not all prisons, not all dungeons, but it is something unique to a mechanic where you can bring a bunch of classes that are heavy on crowd control that can use those skills to make certain parts of the dungeon simply easier. Then of course Blizzard added a lot more classes that can now soothe enrage effects. Enrage effects hit tanks really hard, so bringing the classes like druids and hunters that have some kind of an enrage pacifying effect is worth. A lot of bosses and even a lot of adds have some sort of an enraged mechanic in at least half of the dungeons of BFA that we have so far, minus Siege of Borealis and the King's Rest, which are to come at a later time. So you have certain mechanics where these classes can actually make these boss fights easier, because they're those classes, because they're the Druid with Soothe, or whether they are a Beast Mastery or Survival Hunter with a pet that can kind of calm the enemy down. Of course, you have a lot of enemies that will have some kind of a buff that needs to be dispelled before the enemy really starts taking a lot of damage, so classes like Shadow Priest and even racials like the Blood of Racial really come in handy. And also just some of the examples of what some of the other classes can bring besides just flat extra damage to make themselves unique to their team and unique to the gameplay. You actually have classes that have certain skills, certain unique skills to their class, or certain skills shared between only a few classes that make them unique enough where if you bring that class, you simply make parts of the boss mechanic easier, just flatline easier. And I think that is something that is awesome. I think that is something that shines through in BFA, and I feel like it's one of those steps that Blizzard's taken slowly in the right direction to change up a little bit of their content and how they approach the class design and how will different classes affect this type of scenarios. I was actually genuinely surprised that this is kind of how Blizzard has been structuring their content, and it makes me feel that while it might not be fully realized, I feel that the class uniqueness, class identity, like what do you bring to the table, is a lot more prominent already in BFA than it has been in other expansions. And I'm hoping that Blizzard continues to design their content with so much in mind. I really do enjoy a lot of the content, not only because it's new, not only because it's fresh, but because depending on the composition that you'll bring to each dungeon, your experience will be very, very different. And I feel like that kind of uniqueness is something this game definitely needs. I know that as a viewer, it might be hard to believe that Blizzard is making the right decisions and taking the game in the right direction after the track record of just pruning and pruning and pruning that they've had over the previous expansions. But I feel like Battle for Azeroth is a chance for them to recover from that and to start really putting in the role-playing aspect, the RPG aspects of this game back into World of Warcraft. And BFA is a nice stepping stone with what we've already been able to see so far, and I honestly cannot wait until we see more of Battle for Azeroth and what the rest of the game has to offer as more raids and more prominent content starts to come out in the next few weeks. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I very much hope you enjoyed. I'd like to hear you guys' thoughts on what do you think about class uniqueness in Battle for Azeroth. I really do think that Blizzard is taking right steps so far. I'm very happy with it, and it really did surprise me, which is why I felt like it was worth making a whole video for this. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see all of you in another video.